Picture this. You're standing beneath towering pillars, their faces ripped and scratched, like someone tried to claw time itself from the stone. The desert heat presses down. The dust tastes like old altars and ground limestone, and the only sound is the relentless crack of hammer on wall. Names, faces, whole lifetimes chipped away. The halls of Karnak carry the noise like thunder. It isn't random vandalism, it's a verdict. A sentence on a revolution the state decided must not survive. The year is 1334 BC. The Pharaoh who defied 3 millennia of tradition is gone. His city is empty, his god deserted, and his name, Akhenaten, the one pleasing to the Aten, is being cut from Egypt's memory so thoroughly you'd think he never lived. Yet not even 2 decades earlier, this same man was the world's most powerful ruler. He stared into the burning sun and declared that everything his ancestors taught was wrong. If you love exploring the past without the myths, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. It's wild that we can follow these ancient stories together across continents and time zones. Our story starts quietly. In 1353 BC, a teenage prince named Amenhotep IV takes the throne. His father, Amenhotep III, left him a golden inheritance, 38 years of wealth, stability, and power. Egypt's empire ran from Nubia up toward the Euphrates. Temples gleamed. The Nile delivered. The gods seemed content. In that world, the job of a young king was simple. Keep the balance, honor Amun-Ra, protect Ma'at, the cosmic order, and don't rock the boat. But something in Amenhotep IV didn't fit that script. Maybe it began on those sunrise mornings when the light broke over the river and lit the world with an intensity that felt personal. Maybe it came from private conversations with priests who treated the Aten, the sun disk, as something more than just another aspect of Ra. Or, as some scholars suggest, perhaps the idea took root in a deeper theological shift, a sense that divinity could be singular, universal, and visible to all. The court at Thebes in those early years was a machine of tradition. Karnak and Luxor dominated the skyline, pylons rising like man-made cliffs. The temple of Karnak alone ran an economy, thousands of priests, scribes, and artisans, estates stretching for miles, coffers heavy with tribute, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis from Afghanistan, ivory from deep Africa. The high priest of Amun was not just a religious figure, but an economic magnate with influence that could rival the throne. Into that world stepped a young king who looked and acted unlike the ideal carved on temple walls. Contemporary depictions show Amenhotep IV as tall and thin, with a long skull, narrow shoulders, and wide hips, features later artists exaggerated. He didn't project the usual square-jawed, invincible pharaoh icon. He stood apart. Still, he had the expected education: hieroglyphs, math, astronomy, warcraft, diplomacy. Yet somewhere in that curriculum, a spark caught. Hymns to the Aten may have been the tinder, or news filtering in from abroad, ideas travelling along trade routes, nudged him towards something new. By year 4 of his reign, Amenhotep IV began building temples for the Aten rite in Thebes, audaciously, in the shadow of Amun's grandest sanctuary. The move was not just religious, it was political theatre. The first tremors of change showed up in art, not edicts. The stiff, eternal poses of traditional Egyptian style softened. Suddenly, reliefs showed the royal family in intimate scenes beneath the Aten's radiating arms, sun rays ending in tiny hands, offering the ankh of life. Instead of ageless ideal forms, you got tender moments, parents with children, gestures full of warmth. In a culture that used art to express timeless truths rather than fleeting reality, this was a jolt. Beside him stood his queen, Nefertiti. Not a distant emblem of royal perfection, but a vivid, present person in the art, alive. Royal marriages usually serve geopolitics, but many Egyptologists note the possibility of a real romantic partnership here. Their daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenaten, and others, aren't background props. They're depicted as true children, tugging at their parents, playing in the light. Even their names were statements. Meritaten, beloved of the Aten. Akhenaten, she lives for the Aten. The family itself was becoming a theological canvas. The priesthood of Amun was paying attention. For centuries, they had overseen the rituals of eternity, safeguarded a complex theology with hundreds of deities and elaborate funerary rites, and managed estates that fed a nation. Now the young king seemed to be implying that the entire edifice, stories, rites, privileges, was superstition. The implications weren't just spiritual, they were financial. The Amun temples controlled enormous resources: land, herds, labor, and networks of skilled personnel. Shifting loyalties and reallocating assets would tear at the fabric of the state. In his 5th year, the king crossed a line. He renounced the name that honored Amun and became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. Nefertiti's titulary shifted to praise the Aten's beauty. Their daughters' names followed suit. But the change of names was only the beginning. By year 6, Akhenaten decided to do the unthinkable: abandon Thebes entirely and build a fresh capital dedicated to a single god. He called it Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten. The choice to leave Thebes, the religious engine of Egypt for half a millennium, was a high-stakes gamble. Thebes had the tombs of his ancestors, the bureaucracy, the artisans, all the gears that made empire work. Walking away could look like visionary clarity or reckless hubris. The site he chose lay on the east bank of the Nile, roughly midway between Thebes and Memphis, hemmed by an arc of limestone cliffs. At dawn, the sun appears to rise straight out of those cliffs, a daily visual that perfectly suited his theology. No old shrines, no inherited gods, a blank slate. Construction was fast and methodical. Quarries opened in the cliffs. Barges hauled stone downriver. Cedar from Lebanon, sandstone and granite from the south. Materials flowed in. The builders used a clever system of standardized blocks called talatat, small enough for one person to carry, perfect for rapid assembly at monumental scale. Within about 2 years, the bones of a city appeared. Palaces, offices, housing, and the grand spaces for worship and ceremony. The city stretched for miles along the river, linked by a royal road that let the king move between official and private quarters without leaving the protected precinct. At the center rose the great temple of the Aten, vast and open air, the opposite of traditional Egyptian sanctuaries with their inner, shadowed mysteries. No dark inner rooms, no veiled statue hidden from the public. Courtyards replaced corridors. Hundreds of offering tables lay under the sky. The god was literally the sun, visible to all. No need for go-betweens. That openness wasn't just architectural, it was ideological. Atenism, as it evolved in Akhenaten, presented a single creator whose power became visible in the sun's disk. The Aten made all life, humans, cattle, birds, plants, sustained the rhythms of day and night, fed nations, and did so impartially. A hymn carved in a courtier's tomb, often called the Great Hymn to the Aten, and sometimes linked to Akhenaten himself, praises a solitary creator who brings the world into being alone, hidden yet manifest in light. Some historians note resonances with later texts like Psalm 104. Whether there's a direct line of influence is debated, but the thematic parallels are striking. By his 9th year, Akhenaten moved the full court to the new city. The royal palace sprawled along the riverbanks with gardens, pools, aviaries, and painted rooms alive with scenes of flora and fauna. It was open, green, and filled with light, a palace that behaved more like a garden than a fortress. Walls blossomed with images of lilies, papyrus, migrating birds, fish glittering in painted water. It looked like a world reordered around nature and light. For those who followed him, life in Akhenaten was exhilarating and disorienting. They were part of an experiment, reorganizing a civilization's center of gravity around a single divine idea. Daily rituals synchronized with the sun. Before dawn, the court gathered to greet the first light. Midday, When the sun stood highest, the ceremonies affirmed the Aten's fullness. At sunset, the tone turned contemplative, trusting in the light's return. These cycles structured time, fused politics with theology, and kept the message clear. Life flows from the Aten, but power has to reproduce itself. There was a problem. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters, no son. In royal Egypt, that wasn't just a personal issue. It was a state crisis. Succession was never simple. Birth, religious legitimacy, military acceptance, diplomacy, all mattered. Under Atenism, the stakes rose. Any heir had to be fully invested in the new theology to prevent a rollback. That narrowed the field. What came next is one of the most difficult chapters of the Amarna story. After Nefertiti fades from the record around year 12, her fate is still debated. Death, disgrace, or a new role under another name. Akhenaten appears to have turned inward to his immediate family to secure a successor. Royal incest had precedents in Egypt, including sibling marriages among pharaohs. But the pattern in Akhenaten's late reign went further. His eldest daughter, Meritaten, begins to appear in the visual record in queenly roles, standing beside her father in ceremonies, receiving the Aten's rays, wearing queenly regalia. By about year 13, she is recognized as chief queen. Meritaten would have been around 16. We don't have her voice, but it's not hard to imagine the strain. The palatial art had celebrated parental tenderness, playfulness, domestic warmth. Now she was expected to occupy a role that mixed daughterly devotion with queenly partnership to the same man. The theological rationale within Atenism framed the royal family as a mirror of divine self-sufficiency, the Aten as both father and mother of all that lives, generating creation from itself. For the royal house to embody that unity, the line had to turn inward. Practically, it kept succession away from rival branches and concentrated divine legitimacy. Meritaten's period as chief queen seems to have lasted a few years. Then the politics grew more tangled. A figure named Smenkhkare emerges, possibly a brother, son, or chosen heir, who becomes co-ruler and marries Meritaten. In effect, she becomes wife to 2 kings. The logic, seen against the geopolitical situation, clarifies somewhat. The empire was under pressure abroad, and a co-regent with military focus could stabilize the frontiers while Akhenaten pursued his religious program. Smenkhkare's name, meaning vigorous is the Ka of Ra, suggests a return to martial strength. The marriage to Meritaten tied him firmly to the ruling house. At the same time, Akhenaten elevated another daughter, Ankhesenpaten, to chief queen. She was likely only 13 or 14. Her name, She Lives for the Aten, was practically a manifesto. But the images from this phase are hard to look at. A very young girl, in full queenly regalia beside her father, reproducing poses that once featured Nefertiti. The human toll is impossible to quantify, but the strain on identity and family boundaries would have been immense, not only for her, but for sisters watching roles shift around them like moving sand. These unions were not merely ceremonial. Scenes from Amarna show intimate domestic life that imply true marital roles for the daughter queens. Then, tragedy. In the royal tomb, the death of Meketaten is depicted with heart-wrenching specificity. A young woman on a birthing bed, attendants rushing, a nurse holding an infant. The scene strongly suggests Meketaten died in childbirth. The paternity of the child is uncertain, but given the pattern of the family arrangements, the implications are deeply troubling and speak to the dangers of early pregnancy in the ancient world. While the court tangled its lineage to secure the future, the world outside Akhenaten frayed. We know this thanks to the Amarna letters, clay tablets of diplomatic correspondence found in the city's ruins. They reveal vassal rulers in Syria-Palestine pleading for help against enemies and internal rivals. May the king send archers, one governor begs. If there are no archers, the lands will perish. Messages arrived from Jerusalem, Byblos, and beyond. The responses when they came were vague, delayed, or insufficient. Egypt's once formidable military machine, honed under Amenhotep III, seemed idle. Enemies noticed. Inside Egypt, the old priesthood didn't vanish. They waited. Local temples likely continued traditional worship quietly, while publicly nodding to the Aten. For everyday people, Atenism offered little comfort. A god that was light itself, without stories or personal care, felt abstract compared to familiar deities like Isis who protected families, or Ptah who watched over craftsmen. Festivals that once animated village calendars were replaced by ceremonies centered on the royal family's bond with the sun. The revolution, which promised immediacy, began to feel distant and exclusive. Even the groundbreaking art of the early years shifted. What first looked like honesty, wrinkles, affection, movement, grew stylized in a different way. Late statues of Akhenaten show exaggerated features: elongated head, soft chest, wide hips. Some interpret this as theological symbolism, embodying both masculine and feminine creative power. Whatever the intent, the image disturbed many viewers then and now, and the family scenes became visual riddles: a king, his daughter wives, children who might also be heirs, relationships stacked in ways the traditional iconography had no grammar for. By the later years of the reign, the experiment showed strain. The empire's grip in Asia loosened. Daughters died. Smenkhkare's co-regency was brief and ends in obscurity. The court grew uneasy. Some officials likely began rebuilding ties with the old cults in case the pendulum swung back. Archaeology hints at decline in parts of Akhenaten. Workshops shuttered, neighborhoods thinning. The palace and main temples gleamed, the rest frayed. Creativity calcified into repetition. The Aten's rays, the same postures, the same motifs. A theology that had promised direct connection risked becoming its own rigid system. In year 17, around 1336 BC, Akhenaten died. No dramatic record, no clear cause. Some propose a genetic condition or cumulative stress. The truth remains unknown. The relentless inbreeding within the royal family during these years likely increased health risks, as later DNA studies suggest. His passing opened a short, uncertain chapter. A ruler known as Neferuaten appears, possibly Nefertiti under a new name, or a daughter taking the throne. It's a tantalizing might have been. Could a woman pharaoh have preserved parts of the Atenist vision while mending the state's fractures? We can't say. What we do know is that powerful forces, priests, generals, administrators, were ready to restore the old order. From that nexus of grief and maneuvering would emerge a child who later became a household name, Tutankhaten. He was probably 8 or 9 when crowned. Modern genetic work indicates his parents were full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and a sister wife, evidence of the dynasty's inward turn. The boy king wouldn't rule alone. Seasoned courtiers stepped in. An elder statesman with deep ties to the court, and Horemheb, a commanding general. Their mission was restoration. Tutankhaten's wife was Ankhesenpaten, the same princess who had been elevated as chief queen in the final years at Akhenaten. Her life had already spanned daughter, wife, stepmother, and now queen again, this time to a boy who was probably her half-brother, possibly nephew, and in some reconstructions even her son. The relationships are complex, and scholars caution that some links remain uncertain. Their marriage became a bridge between the revolution and the restoration. Within a few years, the shift was unmistakable. The boy king changed his name to Tutankhamun, honoring Amun. The court left Akhenaten and returned to traditional centers. Aten temples closed, their wealth flowed back to the older cults. A decree at Karnak described temples in ruin and the land topsy-turvy, framing the Amarna years as disorder that required healing. The focus was on rebuilding. Ritual calendars revived, priests reclaimed authority, artists returned to timeless idealization. The open-air sanctuaries gave way to shadowed halls and inner chambers again. Economically, estates transferred to the Aten were reallocated to traditional temples, with compensation in some cases. Trade routes stabilized as partners saw continuity return. In the arts, the counter-revolution was sweeping. The domestic tenderness so characteristic of Amarna vanished from official imagery. Palaces became fortresses again. Distance, not intimacy, defined kingship. And yet the most decisive act was still ahead. After Tutankhamun's early death, around age 19, and a brief interlude under Ai, General Horemheb seized the throne. He didn't just restore, he erased. He ordered Akhenaten's name chiseled out, statues smashed, temples dismantled. Akhenaten was cannibalized block by block, its talatat reused in later buildings. Official king lists skipped the entire Amarna sequence. This wasn't debate, it was deletion. In ancient Egyptian belief, to be forgotten was to die a second death. That was the verdict. For over 3,000 years, it worked. The desert kept its secrets. Only in the late 19th century did archaeologists piece together the scale of the revolution from ruins and records. Modern science added details, DNA revealing the costs of insular marriages, the fragile health of Tutankhamun, the human toll behind carved stone, and so we return to those hammers at Karnak. Every blow trying to silence a moment when one man stood against tradition, believed light alone could be enough, and staked a civilization on that vision. What remains are fragments, art that still feels alive, letters pleading for soldiers, hymns that sing of a single creator, and a city's ghost along the Nile where the sun still rises from limestone cliffs like a promise. Akhenaten was never just a city, it was a statement carved into the desert. But statements don't hold borders, and Egypt's borders were fraying. The Amarna letters, those baked clay time capsules, make it painfully clear. Governors and vassal kings from the Levant wrote with a mixture of reverence and panic. "To the king, my lord, my god, my son," they begin, then quickly move to the point. Enemies massing, cities switching sides, tribute threatened. They ask for archers, the backbone of Egypt's overseas presence. Often they get platitudes, sometimes gifts, rarely soldiers. Some historians suggest that the reshuffling of wealth from Amun temples into Aten institutions disrupted the logistics networks that moved grain, weapons, and pay. Others argue Akhenaten simply prioritized theology over strategy. Either way, the machine that had projected Egyptian power northward under Amenhotep III sputtered. Inside Egypt, the shift from a pantheon with intimate protective deities to the austere universality of the Aten felt like a spiritual recession for ordinary people. The Aten illuminated everyone, but didn't talk back. There were no healing myths, no consoling rituals for the anxious mother, the worried farmer, the grieving artisan, at least not outside the formal court worship. In village shrines and private corners, traditional practices likely continued. Archaeology suggests household figurines and amulets didn't vanish. A quiet countercurrent ran beneath the official tide. Art captured the contradictions. Early Amarna reliefs breathe. Movements caught mid-gesture, the Aten's hands cupping ankhs over faces, the royal family laughing, touching, living. By the later years, the imagery tightens into formula. The same rays, the same poses, less spontaneity. The style that once promised freedom now polishes a new orthodoxy. The king's own portrayal becomes an argument in stone. Elongated skull, narrow torso, swelling hips, soft chest. Interpreters split. Some see medical explanations, a genetic condition. Others see theology made flesh, a sovereign embodying both generative principles, father and mother in one body, mirroring a God who births the world from itself. The truth may sit at an intersection of symbol and physiology. Regardless, the message unsettled those who expected a warrior king's confidence carved into granite, and hovering over everything was the succession crisis. With no son by Nefertiti, Akhenaten turned increasingly to his daughters to secure the line. Meritaten's elevation as chief queen formalized a role the art had been hinting at for years. Her visibility in ritual scenes wasn't mere pageantry. It underlined the royal family's monopoly on divine contact. When Smenkhare appears, briefly sharing power and marrying Akhenaten, the politics harden. A military-tinged co-regency to steady the ship while maintaining theological continuity through the marriage bond. Then Akhenaten steps into the queenly role, young, luminous, and shockingly unready by our standards. The art shows her with an elegance that tries to mask the reality of her age. In the carved intimacy of palace reliefs, a troubling pattern becomes ordinary. The palace becomes a maze in which daughter, wife, queen, and heir producer are titles that slide across the same name. In the royal tomb, Akhenaten's death scene slices through the ideology with raw human grief. Attendants crowding a birthing bed, a nurse holding a newborn, parents distraught. A family trying to solve theology with blood pays the price in blood. While the desert city worked to make heaven visible, the wider world moved. The Hittites pushed hard in Anatolia and Syria. Vassals wavered. The Amarna letters track alliances thinning like old rope. Some historians propose that Egypt's aura of invincibility faded as fast as its diplomatic responsiveness. Foreign rulers had been used to lavish attention under Amenhotep III. Gifts, marriages, gold shipments that said, "We're watching." Akhenaten, consumed by his internal project, seemed distant, and distance in geopolitics invites experiment. Within Akhenaten, the scale remained dazzling even as stress lines spread. The great Aten temple's offering tables could be piled high daily, bread, beer, meat, flowers, to be bathed in sunlight, consumed symbolically by divinity, distributed practically to priests and workers. Processions followed the royal road, chariots flashing in the light, guards in neat ranks, courtiers bowing low as the king and queen passed beneath the sky's open canopy. The palace complex, with its window of appearances, let the king show himself to the people without dissolving the aura of sacred distance. Rooms frescoed with reeds and fish tried to make life feel abundant in a planned oasis. But pottery shards and building layers don't lie. Later deposits in ordinary neighborhoods show abandonment. Workshops that once sent furniture inlaid with ivory and ebony to the palace go silent. The Talatat blocks, so useful for speed, whisper a grim prophecy. What is quickly built can be quickly dismantled. Then, the silence of a death. Year 17. Akhenaten is gone. No grand funerary text explains the end. No detailed stela chronicles triumph over illness or enemies. The vacuum draws shadows. Neferuaten stands in the gap, possibly Nefertiti adopting kingly titulary, possibly a daughter stepping into the double crown. If it was Nefertiti, the move would make sense. She had long appeared beside Akhenaten as near equal in ritual scenes, sometimes smiting enemies, sometimes crowned like a king. A capable co-ruler could have tempered the revolution into something sustainable, but the record blurs, then breaks. After the blur comes clarity. Tutankhaten, a child king. Genetic studies in the 21st century offered hard data that Egyptologists suspected his parents were full siblings. The result was a fragile body layered with ailments. He is crowned into a court already pivoting. The elder statesman, and Horemheb, the general, understand what must be done to stabilize the state. Names begin to change. Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun. Amunin, Aten out. The queen's name shifts too. Ankhesempaten becomes Ankhesenamun. Language itself is a lever of policy. The restoration isn't framed as revenge. It's framed as repair. The Karnak restoration. Stela doesn't list enemies to punish. It lists temples to mend. Shrines had become desolate, it says, overgrown, neglected, pathways cutting through sanctuaries as if sacred space were nothing. The solution is practical. Reopen sanctuaries, reinstall cult statues, restart festivals, put priests back on payrolls, reassign estates. Egypt is a religious economy, and economies run on rhythms. Rebuild the rhythms, and you rebuild the state. Art swings back to tradition with relief. Gone are the wrinkles and slouches. The king is young, muscled, eternal again. Domestic tenderness yields to cosmic duty. Processions, offerings, victories, each scene a promise that the world is as it should be. Architecture follows suit. Closed courts, darkened sanctuaries, priestly gates. The sun still shines, but inside the temple, mystery returns. Meanwhile, Akhenaten empties, the king's court relocates. Administrations reoccupy Memphis and Thebes. The Aten's temple staff is disbanded or repurposed. Talatat blocks begin their second life, chopped, carted, stacked into the cores of pylons and walls elsewhere. Centuries later, when those later structures are repaired, thousands of Amarna-era blocks will tumble out like a time capsule, their painted scenes preserved on hidden faces. Tutankhamun's reign is brief and in many ways gentle. He is guided, protected, and steered. He pays for restoration, receives foreign envoys, hunts, and, if some injuries in his remains are clues, may have trained for war. He dies around 19. The cause remains debated: infection after a leg injury, complications from malaria, congenital vulnerabilities, likely a tangle rather than a single thread. His widow, Akhenaten, is left in a perilous position. One extraordinary letter, preserved in Hittite archives, may be hers. A queen of Egypt writes to the Hittite king. Her husband is dead, she has no son, and she asks for a Hittite prince to marry and make king. If this letter is indeed Akhenaten's, and many scholars think it is, it reveals a desperate gambit to avoid marriage to a man she did not want, perhaps I. The Hittite prince who set out for Egypt never arrived. He was killed en route. The door to that alternate history slammed shut. I takes the throne briefly. His reign is a bridge, short, careful, focused on continuity. Then Horemheb, the general who had kept Egypt's military skeleton intact, becomes king. His program is not half measures. He rewrites the record. The official king lists omit the Amarna pharaohs. Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Neferneferuaten, and even Tutankhamun are excised from the royal narrative. Horemheb's edicts punish corruption, reassert central control, and reallocate temple wealth with a discipline that suggests years of pent-up reform. The erasure campaign is surgical and sweeping. Names are the soul of Egyptian memory, and chisels are deployed accordingly. Akhenaten's cartouches are hammered out wherever they appear. Statues are smashed or their faces recut. The Aten temples, so open to the sky, are easiest to dismantle. No deep sanctuaries to defend their heart, no heavy monoliths to resist. Akhenaten becomes a quarry. The desert, indifferent as always, begins to take back the streets, but ideas rarely die completely. Even as the state closed ranks around tradition, echoes remained. The great hymn to the Aten survived on tomb walls. Some artistic softness lingers in isolated works, and the memory of a city that once dared to worship light itself lay just beneath later bricks, waiting. For the people who lived through the shift, the experience must have felt like waking from a vivid, bewildering dream. 1 decade, the sun is your God's face, the royal family is your ladder to heaven, and the court is a garden of open-air sanctuaries. The next, familiar processions return, priests chant old words in shadowed halls, and the faces on the walls look like they always did. Ideal, timeless, safe. If you asked a farmer which world felt more stable, his answer might be practical. The one where the canals are dredged, the granaries are stocked, and the gods listen when you whisper a prayer in your courtyard. Still, the Amarna years left questions that refused to settle. Was Atenism monotheism in a later sense? Some Egyptologists caution against projecting modern categories backward. Akhenaten tolerated some divine epithets and used layered royal theology. Others argue the Aten's exclusivity, especially in later years, was strict enough to count as a genuine break. Did Akhenaten neglect the empire, or was the geopolitical downturn inevitable given Hittite momentum and regional volatility? Did Nefertiti rule in her own right as Neferneferuaten? Each question opens a debate rather than a conclusion. Responsible scholars weigh texts, art, archaeology, and the gaps between them. And then there's the human core of the story. A family sculpted into a doctrine. Meritaten, poised and dutiful. Meketaten, lost young, her death carved with staggering empathy. Akhenaten, navigating a maze of identities and marriages before becoming the wife of Tutankhamun, and then a queen writing across borders for help. Their names are poetry and policy at once. Their lives remind us that grand ideas play out in private rooms, around birthing beds, in whispers behind screens. Centuries rolled on. Horemheb's successors, Seti I, Rameses II, built big and thought long. They fought the Hittites, signed famous treaties, carved their victories deep into walls. On those walls, the Amarna gap stays quiet. Yet, ironically, the erasers preserved. By burying the blocks of Akhenaten inside later monuments, they shielded scenes that would have weathered to dust. When modern restorers pulled apart pylons and found talatats stuffed within, they also pulled apart 3,000 years of curated silence. In the late 19th century, archaeologists arrived at the lonely arc of cliffs above Tel El Amarna, the modern name for Akhenaten. They traced boundaries stalely cut into the rock, monuments where Akhenaten had outlined the city's sacred limits and his own devotion. In the desert scrub, they mapped palaces, villas, workshops, streets, and cemeteries. They found the Bureau of Correspondence with its cache of clay tablets, the Amarna letters. They read pleas, promises, complaints, a bureaucracy's heartbeat captured in cuneiform. They cleared the royal tomb and stood before the reliefs of grief. They understood, for the first time in millennia, how large the gamble had been. Modern science added another layer. CT scans and DNA work on the royal mummies mapped a kind of family tree draped in red flags. Close kin marriages repeated, congenital conditions likely, infections piling onto fragile frames. Tutankhamun's feet compromised, his leg injured, his immune system battling. The boy who restored the gods paid the price of a family policy built on theological purity. If you strip the story to its essentials, you're left with a paradox. Akhenaten wanted to make the divine immediate. No doors, no dark sanctuaries, no intermediaries. Just sunlight flooding an altar while a human king and queen raised bread and flowers to the sky. That vision needed a court, a city, a family to embody it. But the more he tightened the circle, the more he made the royal family the only lens through which the Aten's favor passed. The more the system depended on private bodies and fragile lives. When those lives faltered, the vision cracked. When the world pressed from outside, the walls weren't thick enough, and yet the hymns still sing. How manifold are your works, the poet wrote to the Aten. You made the earth as you desired, you alone. You can hear in those lines a breathless awe that belongs to anyone who's ever watched a sunrise flood a landscape. It's a feeling older than any temple and newer than any doctrine. It survives erasure. By the time Horemheb finished his program, the state had a simple message. The gods are back in their places. Egypt is as it should be. In official memory, Akhenaten becomes an interlude to skip. But history doesn't skip, it layers. The stones of Akhenaten became the bones of later buildings. The tenderness of Amarna art changed how eyes look at Egyptian reliefs forever. You can't unsee those moments of laughter and grief. And the question the king asked, can a society be built around a single visible principle of divinity, echoes far beyond his lifetime. In the next part, we'll walk through the last act, the forensic unmasking of Amarna by modern archaeology, the rediscovery of Tutankhamun that reignited the world's imagination, and the long shadow Akhenaten casts across debates about monotheism, power, and memory. We'll return to Karnak's hammer marks and stand once more in the sun at Tel El Amarna, tracing the city's streets with the map we've rebuilt from fragments. The story of Akhenaten might have stayed buried, if not for ruins that refused to stay quiet, and scholars who learned to listen. The desert preserves what the Nile forgets, and Tel El Amarna, modern name for Akhenaten, held a city in suspended animation. When archaeologists began their work in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they didn't just find stones, they found a blueprint for a vanished idea. Boundary stelae carved into the encircling cliffs read like manifestos. Akhenaten speaks directly, dedicating the horizon of the Aten with a personal, almost intimate tone. These rock-cut declarations fix the city's limits in sacred geography. Stand before one at dawn, and the sun will crest where the king meant it to. Inside those lines, excavators traced the royal road, the great Aten Temple, the small Aten Temple, the King's House, the North Riverside Palace, and administrative compounds. Villas revealed courtyards shaded by pergolas, storerooms with amphorae stamped from Syrian and Canaanite ports, and reception halls with floors painted as ponds, fish flicking between water lilies, birds hovering over reeds. Even the humbler houses showed careful planning. Ovens, niches for household gods, low platforms for sleeping, water jars lined up like punctuation marks. Then came the archive, the Amarna letters, hundreds of clay tablets, inscribed in cuneiform, the international diplomatic script of the late Bronze Age, lay in the ruins of the Bureau of Correspondence. They preserved voices, formal, formulaic, but urgent. One governor writes that his enemies are stronger than me. May the king send help. Another reports grain shortages and shifting loyalties. The tablets map a reality check on royal ideology. Empires run on supplies, not just sunlight. In the necropolis east of the city, tombs for courtiers and the royal family cut into the limestone carry reliefs that are startling even now. You can stand in a chamber and see the great hymn to the Aten flowing down a wall, then turn and confront grief carved with an honesty that defies convention. The scene of Akhenaten's death in childbirth, attendants bent in sorrow, parents reaching toward a daughter they cannot save. The Amarna style could be celebratory and severe, but it could also be painfully human. Elsewhere, a different kind of archive lay hidden inside later buildings. When Horemheb and his successors reused Amarna's talatat blocks as filler for pylons and walls at Karnak and elsewhere, they unintentionally made a time capsule. In the 20th century, conservators dismantling those later structures discovered the small blocks by the thousands, many still bearing the painted reliefs from Aten temples, the rays ending in tiny hands, the king and queen beneath their halo of life symbols, offering tables marching in orderly rows. Scholars painstakingly photographed, catalogued, and digitally reassembled scenes like a giant jigsaw that had been scattered across centuries. Piece by piece, a visual gospel of Atenism re-emerged. Meanwhile, in the Valley of the Kings, a discovery in 1922 electrified the world: the tomb of Tutankhamun, largely intact. Howard Carter's torch beams slid across sealed doors, gold shrines, chariots, beds shaped like divine animals, and jewelry that turned museum lights into aurora. The boy king, who had been a footnote in official king lists, became the face of ancient Egypt for the modern public. Yet his burial, with its dazzling wealth, also told a political story. The iconography is resolutely traditional. Amun and Osiris back in their places, protective goddesses embracing the sarcophagus, spells guiding the king through the night. The tomb is a monument to restoration, created by artisans who had learned their craft in Amarna's workshops and then adapted their hands to older patterns. Look closely, and you can still sense Amarna's finesse in some details: the delicate inlay, the naturalistic touches, translated into a different theological grammar. Modern science transformed the debate again in the 21st century. CT scans and DNA testing on the royal mummies mapped kinship and health. Results indicate that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and a royal sister. The scans revealed a clubbed foot, bone necrosis in the leg, and evidence of malaria parasites. The famous head shape in Amarna art did not match dramatic cranial deformation in the remains. The elongated skulls in statues appear to be stylistic or symbolic rather than anatomical. These findings sharpen the picture. The family's inward marriage policy increased genetic risk. The art's androgyny likely served theological messaging more than medical portraiture. As the data grew, so did caution. Historians emphasize that Amarna's categories don't map cleanly onto modern terms. Was Atenism monotheism in the strict sense? In its later phase, Atenist doctrine appears exclusivist. Texts sometimes omit or subordinate other gods, and Akhenaten promoted the Aten as sole creator. Yet the language and institutions remained embedded in Egyptian royal theology, with the king as the Aten's unique mediator. Some scholars prefer monolatry or henotheism, highlighting exclusive worship of one god without denying others' existence. The safest stance is nuanced. Atenism represented a historically significant move toward exclusive devotion to a single universal creator, articulated within Egypt's royal religious framework. It is believed that such a move, while not identical to later monotheisms, contributed to the broader Near Eastern discourse on divine unity. The question of niche power, how to anchor legitimacy, runs through the whole episode. Traditional Egyptian kingship balanced military success, temple patronage, and ma'at. Akhenaten rewrote the balance, centering legitimacy on intimacy with a single god and embodying that relationship in family and city. In the short term, the strategy produced art and architecture of astonishing coherence. In the long term, it proved fragile. A system that narrows divine access to a single household is only as strong as that household's health and politics. Memory, in Egypt, is a technology. Names carved in stone keep a person alive. Erasure is annihilation. Horemheb weaponized that technology, but erasure is imperfect. Reused blocks, buried archives, and texts in out-of-the-way tombs leaked the Amarna story back into the record. In a twist of fate, the pharaoh whose name was chiseled out now has one of the most studied reigns in the ancient world. The very attempt to delete him made the rediscovery dramatic. Today, walking across Tel El Amarna, you can trace streets in the dust. The outlines of rooms remain, low and stubborn. The Great Aten Temple is a flat expanse open to the sky. The offering tables are now stone foundations, their purpose written in the ground. If you stand on the royal road and face east before sunrise, the cliffs begin to glow. You can imagine the processions, chariots rolling, gold flashing, music rising as the first rays stretch their hands across the city. It is quiet now, but the geometry is still there. A city designed as an instrument to place sunlight. The debates continue, responsibly and with care. Did Nefertiti rule as Nefer-Neferuaten? The evidence is suggestive. Inscriptions that fit her epithets, images of a ruler with feminine grammatical forms, panels showing a sovereign performing kingly acts. Some historians argue for her regency or brief solo rule. Others caution that Smenkhare fills the slot. Was Smenkhare Akhenaten's son, brother, or chosen heir? The sources are thin and interpretations differ. Was the collapse of Egypt's Asian holdings a direct result of Akhenaten's neglect, or part of a wider late Bronze Age turbulence that any pharaoh would have struggled to master? It is believed that both internal focus and external pressures mattered. The Amarna letters show real-time distress that likely needed stronger responses than were given. Even the ethics of the Amarna family arrangements demand sensitive handling. Father-daughter and sibling unions existed in royal ideology before and after Akhenaten, but the concentration of such marriages during his late reign stands out. Scholars present the evidence soberly: inscriptions, reliefs, titles, and tomb scenes. Where the record is ambiguous, they say so. The aim is understanding, not sensationalism. What, then, is Akhenaten's legacy? 3 threads endure. First, a vision of divine universality made visible. The great hymn to the Aten remains one of the most beautiful theological poems from antiquity. It sees the world with integrated wonder. Sunrise awakening creatures, boats steering by light, the foreigner and the Egyptian breathing the same gift. Whatever his politics, the poet Pharaoh or the poet in his circle captured in words a sense of cosmic coherence that still resonates. Second, an artistic revolution that humanized power. The images of the royal family, kissing a child, sharing a loaf, mourning a daughter, changed how we understand Egyptian art. They do not negate the older canon, they add to it, revealing range and capacity. After Amarna, even traditional art occasionally allows softening at the edges, a hint that the artists had seen another mode and couldn't entirely forget it. Third, a lesson in the politics of memory. States curate their pasts. They cut, paste, and sometimes delete. Yet the past has a way of growing back through cracks. Akhenaten's city, dismantled for parts, left fingerprints everywhere. A chiseled-out cartouche leaves a scar more eloquent than a smooth wall. The story reminds us to look for seams, fillings, and palimpsests, in stone and in narrative. There's a moment in every visit to Amarna when the sun clears the cliff rim and the plateau floods with light. The city's logic snaps into focus. No roof between you and the sky, no curtain between you and the god. You can see why the idea seduced a king. You can see why it frightened a priesthood. You can see why it failed, and why it lingers. As for the hammer marks at Karnak, their echo is still there if you know how to hear it. Each strike says, "This must be forgotten." Each surviving fragment says, "Not quite." Between the two, history finds its voice. So, picture this one last time. You're standing on the royal road at Tel El Amarna. The air tastes of lime and dust. The cliffs are a pale arc. Somewhere under your feet are broken blue-glazed tiles from a palace floor that once gleamed like water. In the distance, a shepherd moves with a small flock, and the modern village shimmers in heat. The sun climbs. For a moment, the city that tried to turn light into law flickers back to life. Then the glare washes it away. But it's not gone. It's layered into everything we've learned about power, faith, art, and the human cost of ideas. Akhenaten's name was meant to be erased. Instead, it became a question mark. A bright, difficult question we keep asking. How far can vision go before it breaks the world that must carry it? If this journey through Amarna's rise and fall sparked your curiosity, leave a comment with the site or artifact you'd most like us to explore next. And if you're new here, subscribe for more deep dives into the stories buried beneath the sands and the ones chiseled out of the walls.